Hello, I want us to have some time and discuss yet another important set of basic concepts of research, namely research hypothesis, scope of the study, limitation of the study, as well as justification of the study. Let's begin by understanding what hypothesis is. A hypothesis can be understood to mean a specific, clear, and testable proposition or statement about the possible outcomes of a scientific study. In other words, researchers are expected to provide a tentative statement about what they consider to be the relationship between the independent and dependent variables in their studies. When we are formulating a hypothesis, we are assuming that there is a way on how independent variable in our study determines the outcome of the study, and also how dependent variable in that study depends on the independent variables. Therefore, when we talk about hypotheses, we are largely concerned about two specific variables and how they relate to each other. These are independent and dependent variables. There are two broad types of hypotheses. These are alternative or research hypothesis and null hypothesis. Alternative hypothesis is one which assumes that there is a relationship between the independent and dependent variables being studied. For instance, we may be interested in understanding the relationship between unemployment and why the youth get involved in crime. In this case, our alternative hypothesis would read that there is a relationship between unemployment and youth involvement in crime. Null hypothesis, on the other hand, assumes that there is no relationship between the independent and dependent variables. If we are to take the example that I've just been given, that I've just given out, that is the one that seeks to understand the relationship between unemployment and youth involvement in crime, for our case, for our null hypothesis would read that there is no relationship between unemployment and youth involvement in crime. I wish to also observe that although both hypotheses are applicable in research, most scholarly studies are encouraged to adopt the null hypothesis. This is because it is believed that when you deny the existence of the relationship between the two sets of variables that you seek to study, then it offers you a chance to go in depth and understand things deeply, so that at the end you either affirm or deny the non-existence of the independent and dependent variables that you assumed at the beginning of your study. Another important concept that I want us to understand now is scope of the study. Scope basically refers to the elements that will be covered in any given study. That is, how wide is the study in terms of the geographical area average, in terms of the population, as well as in terms of the thematic issues that the researcher seeks to address in any given research problem. The main purpose of the scope of the study is to explain to the scientific community the extent to which the research area will be explored, and therefore specifies the parameters to observe. For instance, what is the population of your focus? How far is your study going to cover geographically? Is it in a ward? Is it in a sub-county? Is it in a county? Is it in the whole country? Is it within a region, for instance, the geographical region, for instance, the East African region or Eastern Africa? That therefore becomes the geographical area that your study will cover. Then we talk about the thematic areas, that is, the specific issues that your study seeks to address. Thematic areas are informed by the specific objectives that the study seeks to address. Therefore, specific objective one is one area of a thematic scope. 2 is another area of thematic scope, and 3 is another area of a thematic scope. That is, if say you have 4 specific objectives, it implies that you are going to have 4 thematic areas that your study seeks to address. Therefore, the scope of a study largely defines the purpose of the study, the population size and the characteristics, the geographical location of the study, the time period within which the study will be conducted, as well as the theories that will be used to guide the study. Why should we have the scope of the study? The scope of the study is considered at the very early stages of the research problem development. That is, before the commencement of data collection. The scope of the study is important because it provides the focus of the work and it offers us to understand what a researcher can practically achieve given a particular time frame within which the research is to be conducted. We therefore look at a scope of the study in terms of its ability to give us clarity of the possible study outcomes because it defines the issue that the study intends to address. In writing a scope of the study, it also helps the reader and also the scientific community as well as the researcher to understand the limits and the context within which the research findings need to be interpreted. This is important because at times people might look at and compare your findings with and argue that they do not reflect the findings of studies that have been done in a different geographical area. So, in doing so, our response would be that our results need to be interpreted within the context of the geographical area where the study was done. This is necessary since certain geographical characteristics may influence human behavior and in the process influence the type of findings that come out given a particular study. Here is a sample of what a scope of the study may look like. For instance, we're interested in understanding in our research problem the personal characteristics considered by college-educated females in the choice of marital partner in Western Kenya. That is the problem of a study. How then can we use that to write our scope of the study? We noted earlier that the first thing that must be stated when you're putting down our scope of the study is the purpose of the study. In this case, we will say that this study will focus on personal characteristics considered by college-educated females in the choice of a marital partner in Western Kenya. The other issue that we stated should be put down in our scope of the study is the study location. That is where the study will be conducted. And therefore, this is what we may have. The study will be carried out in Western Kenya, comprising Kisumu, Siaya, Kisii, Migori, Kakamega, and Bungoma counties. Western Kenya is generally a general term, but now in our scope of the study, we have specifically stated the specific areas within Western Kenya where our study will focus. We further stated that earlier that a scope of the study must also describe the population, so that in our case we will say that the study will use a sample of 250 females selected through stratified random sampling. In that case, we are talking not only the population that the study will focus on, but also the sample size. The third issue, or rather the fourth issue, that should also be on the scope of the study is the thematic areas. As I noted earlier, thematic areas are guided by the specific objectives. In our case, we are interested in understanding how education, income, and marital status of men influence the choice women make in terms of marrying them or not marrying them. And of course, these women must be those that have a minimum of college education. Therefore, in this case, we shall say that personal characteristics will be examined in the context of educational, income, and marital statuses. The last thing that we stated should be given in our scope of the study is the time period as well as the theories that will inform the study. So that in our case, we may say that this study will be conducted from January the year 2022 to August the year 2022. And the study will be guided by two theories, namely rational choice and social exchange theories. At this level, we don't need to explain the suitability of the theories that we are using. That one, we shall explain it under the section on the theoretical framework of the study. Another issue that we need to look at with regard to this particular lecture is the limitation of the study. Limitations in research basically refers to restrictions or constraints arising from the types of methods or methodological approaches a particular study has adopted. Limitations might also be understood as the weaknesses within a research design that may influence the outcome and conclusions of the research. It is expected of researchers to present complete and honest limitations of their studies. This is because the limitations should guide us in terms of how we interpret the research findings. A meaningful presentation of the limitation of the study should describe 1. The potential limitation, 2. Explain the implications of the limitation, 3. Provide possible alternative approaches to overcome the limitation, and describe the steps taken to mitigate the limitations. What are the causes of limitation of the study? 1 is limited access to data. We may not have sufficient access to data because of a number of reasons. 1 could be because the population that we intend to study is generally not easy to identify, such as those engaging in prohibited activities such as drug dealings in drug or commercial sex work, especially in countries where they are prohibited. Knowing physically or identifying physically such people is never easy, and therefore our attempt to reach as many people as possible might not be easy. So we may end up accessing just a fraction of the number, and in the process the views of the few may not generally reflect the views of the many that we are unable to access. Another indication or another reason why it might be difficult for us to access data is because certain studies touches on very sensitive issues, such as those dealing with security. National security issues are regarded as part of government's top secrets, and therefore sometimes if one is engaged in studies focusing on such areas, it might not be easy for that person to get in-depth information or data from the security personnel for fear of being victimized by their seniors in case it is found that they engage in revealing important or secretive security information to the researcher. In that case, therefore, you may not only find it difficult to engage these people in the research, but even if you succeed in engaging them, they may not find it easy to reveal certain information about the issues that you are investigating. Another area that might be quite difficult to obtain information are those that dealing with sensitive issues, such as issues pertaining to sexuality, more so in the context of the African communities. In Africa, sex is regarded as sacred, and therefore issues that are studies that are focusing on human sexuality might not attract as many people as possible, and even if you manage to get the few might have limitations in terms of how much information they may need to advise about their sexuality. Such issues they consider as sensitive and private, and therefore they may not find it easy to share it with researchers, whom in their social cycles they might consider as strangers. Even though we are not able to collect as much data as required, it is still expected of researchers to ensure that they explain to the scientific community that despite not having as much information as they anticipated, the findings of the study that they are presenting are still reliable and valid. Cultural bias is also another factor that leads to limitation or considered as a possible limitation to the study. Sometimes the way we perceive things might not be the same as the way people from other cultures perceive them. Sometimes we interpret phenomena in certain ways that is different from the way others perceive them. And therefore, researchers are likely to interpret phenomena based on the interpretation of the perspectives that they are used to, which may be in conflict or in total indifference to those that are held by the respondents. In that case, therefore, we may interpret our findings, or we may interpret certain things that are going on in the community from our own perspective rather than from the way in which they understood within a given cultural context. For instance, someone physically examining the lifestyles, say, of the Maasai community and finds that these people are living in a Manyatta house, basically a mud wall house, may easily interpret that to be an indicator of poverty. But this might not actually be the same, because the same person living in such a house owns tens of thousands of head of cattle, which in monetary terms are in millions. That person, viewed from outside by an outside researcher, might be perceived as poor, but internally the person is very wealthy, because livestock is an important source and indicator of wealth. So the way we interpret phenomena might conflict with the way society or the population that we're investigating interpret it, and this different interpretation may lead to what we call cultural bias, and in the process may serve as a limitation to the study that we are undertaking. Another cause of limitation Another cause of limitation in research is what we call sample bias. Sample bias occurs when sampling method used does not yield a sample which is reflective of the general population. This is because sometimes we are unable completely to access the entire population that we intended to use in our research. And in that case, we end up engaging or using uh, probability, rather non-probability sampling methods, such as convenient sampling. So that we say, because we are unable to reach everybody or a representative sample of the population that we intended to study, we may now opt to engage anybody that we are able to access. Whether they meet the specific requirements of the study or not, then we end up engaging them. This way, we may end up collecting data from a group that is not fairly representative of the entire population. If you obtain information from a group that is not as representative as is required in research, it is not possible for the finding of such studies to be labeled as generally representative of the entire population, because they are obtained from a population that is biased, a population that does not represent people in terms of the various demographics and other characteristics that the study had outlined to be part and parcel of the population sample. How do we present our study limitation section? First, we are required to identify and describe each limitation in details. For instance, if we say inaccessibility of population, we need to explain that in detail. The second thing we're required to do is we need to explain each limitation as it exists and why it was not easy to overcome it using the kind of methodology approaches that we had employed. Then we also need to assess the impact of each limitation in relation to the overall findings and conclusions of the study, so that we are not merely required to identify the limitation, but we also need to go further and indicate that this kind of limitation, because we are not able to completely overcome it, it may affect our findings in this and that manner. Third, we need to also describe how the limitations that we have identified, and given the impact they have had in our study, what then are we proposing as possible areas to further study, because the limitations that have been observed may not have yielded the desired or what was exactly intended, and because of that there are certain gaps that still remain that further studies need to be undertaken in order to fulfill. There are two broad types of hypotheses. These are alternative or research hypothesis and null hypothesis. Alternative hypothesis is one which assumes that there is a relationship between the independent and the dependent variables being studied. For instance, we may be interested in understanding the relationship between unemployment and why the youth get involved in crime. In this case, our alternative hypothesis would read that there is a relationship between unemployment and youth involvement in crime. Null hypothesis, on the other hand, assumes that there is no relationship between the independent and dependent variables. If we are to take the example that I've just been given, that I've just given out, how do we present our justification for the study? First, explain the research focus and its relationship to the discipline or field of study that supports the need to conduct the proposed study. If, for instance, you are a sociologist, a criminologist, or an economist, it is important to explain what makes your study fit within the broader discipline that you belong. Secondly, describe the issue, the situation, the problem or opportunity that support the need to undertake the study. It is important that we explain what we think is still missing in terms of knowledge development, in terms of problem solving, that we think by undertaking the study we may provide a pathway within which policymakers could use or could follow in order to not only understand the problem that was being investigated, but also the solution to that problem. Thirdly, it is important that you explain how the outcome of the study will benefit the practitioners, the scholars, policymakers, and even study population. Every study has practitioners. We have sociologists, we have economists that are working at policy level, working in the community. We also have scholars undertaking research, teaching, and those that are teaching institution of higher learning. Then we also have policymakers, that is, various government departments and agencies, and also the study population. If the study is focusing on the youth, then it is important that we explain under our justification why that study is important to the youth and how the youth stand to benefit from that study. In doing so, it may provide them with incentives to participate in the study, having known that by doing so, the study is likely to enrich the understanding as to why they get involved with crime and also how best to avoid engaging in crime and possible opportunities that they may enjoy by not engaging in crime. Lastly, we are required to explain how the outcome of this research could be used to advance knowledge, understanding, or practice in a particular field of study. If you are a sociologist, explain how your findings will enrich existing knowledge in that particular field of sociology or enhance understanding of certain issues in that particular field of sociology, or enhance practice in that particular field of sociology. That is very, very important when we are putting down our justification. Without that, then the scientific community may doubt whether whatever we want to do or whatever study we want to undertake, there could be others that are more important than that if we are not able to explain why it is important for us to undertake that study and how various sectors of society stand to benefit from the study. Thank you.